Hello, my witchy friends. Today, I want to take the opportunity to just slow down a little bit, listen to the sound of the rain outside my window. It's a very rainy day today. And read you a witchy story, a short story by Elizabeth Gaskell. And a lot of you have asked, since I started this channel, for a little sampling of some of the research that I do as an academic studying the history of witchcraft and magic. And so I mainly work in literature. And this story that I'm going to read to you is one of the stories that was my entry point into this field. So I thought it would be nice to share it with you. So the story is called Lois the Witch. Lois the Witch. And it's in this anthology called Gothic Tales. Gothic Tales. It's part of the Penguin Classics series. So let me just light a candle very quickly here. And we'll get started. Over here. Okay. So, Elizabeth Gaskell wrote novels mostly, but there are a dozen or so short stories in this collection that are really great. My favorite of her books is actually not a novel at all. It's her autobiography of the life of Charlotte Bronte. It's really, really good. Okay, so this is a fairly long short story. You can see here that it has quite a few chapters. So this is Lois the Witch. And curiously, it does not take place in England, where Elizabeth Gaskell is from. It takes place during the Salem witch trials. In the year 1691, Lois Barclay stood on a little wooden pier, steadying herself on the stable land in much the same manner as 8 or 9 weeks ago she had tried to steady herself on the deck of the rocking ship which had carried her across from Old to New England. It seemed as strange now to be on solid earth as it had been not long ago to be rocked by the sea, both by day and by night, and the aspect of the land was equally strange. The forests which showed in the distance all around, and which in truth were not very far from the wooden houses forming the town of Boston, were of different shades of green, and different too in shape of outline to those which Lois Barclay knew well in her old home in Warwickshire. Her heart sank a little as she stood alone, waiting for the captain of the good ship Redemption, the kind, rough old soldier who was her only known friend in this unknown continent. Captain Holderness was busy, however, as she saw, and it would probably be some time before he would be ready to attend to her. So Lois sat down on one of the casks that lay about and wrapped her grey duffel cloak tight around her, and sheltered herself under her hood, as well as might be from the piercing wind, which seemed to follow those whom it had tyrannized over at sea, with the dogged wish of still tormenting them on land. Very patiently did Lois sit there, although she was weary, and shivering with cold, for the day was severe for May, and the Redemption, with store of necessaries and comforts for the Puritan colonists of New England, was the earliest ship that had ventured across the seas. How could Lois help thinking of the past and speculating on the future as she sat on Boston Pier at this breathing time of her life? In the dim sea mist, which she gazed upon with aching eyes, filled against her will with tears from time to time, there rose the little village church of Barford, not 3 miles from Warwick. You may see it yet, where her father had preached ever since 1661, long before she was born. He and her mother both lay dead in Barford churchyard, and the old, low, grey church could hardly come before her vision without her seeing the old parsonage too, the cottage covered with Austrian roses and yellow jessamine, where she had been born, sole child of parents already long past the prime of youth. She saw the path not 100 yards long from the parsonage to the vestry door, that path which her father trod daily, for the vestry was his study and the sanctum, where he pored over the ponderous tomes of the fathers and compared their precepts with those of the authorities of the Anglican Church of that day, the day of the later Stuarts, for Barford parsonage at that time scarcely exceeded in size and dignity the cottages by which it was surrounded. It only contained 3 rooms on a floor, but was 2 stories high. On the first or ground floor were the parlor, kitchen, and back or working kitchen. Upstairs, Mr. and Mrs. Barclay's room that belonging to Lois, and the maid-servant's room. If a guest came, Lois left her own chamber and shared old Clemence's bed. But those days were over. Never more should Lois see father or mother on earth. They slept calm and still in Barford churchyard, careless of what became of their orphan child, as far as earthly manifestations of care or love went. And Clemence lay there too, bound down in her grassy bed by wives of the briar rose, which Lois had trained over the 3 precious graves before leaving England forever. There were some who would have fain have kept her there, one who swore in his heart a great oath upon the Lord, that he would seek her sooner or later, if she was still upon the earth. But he was the rich heir and only son of the miller Lucy, whose mill stood by the Avon side in the grassy Barford meadows, and his father looked higher for him than the penniless daughter of Parson Barclay. So low were clergymen esteemed in those days. And the very suspicion of Hugh Lucy's attachment to Lois Barclay made his parents think it more prudent not to offer the orphan a home, although none other of the parishioners had the means, even if they had the will to do so. So Lois swallowed her tears down till the time came for crying, and acted upon her mother's words. Lois, thy father is dead of this terrible fever, and I am dying. Nay, it is so. Though I am easier from pain for these few hours, the Lord be praised. The cruel men of the Commonwealth have left thee very friendless. Thy father's only brother was shot down at Edgehill. I, too, have a brother, though thou hast never heard me speak of him, for he was a schismatic. And thy father and he had words, and he left for that new country beyond the seas without ever saying farewell to us. But Ralph was a kind lad until he took up these newfangled notions, and for the old days' sake he will take thee in and love thee as a child, and place thee among his children. Blood is thicker than water. Write to him as soon as I am gone. For Lois, I am going, and I bless the Lord that has let me join my husband again so soon. Such was the selfishness of conjugal love. She thought little of Lois's desolation in comparison with her rejoicing over her speedy reunion with her dead husband. Write to thine uncle Ralph Hixson, Salem, New England. Put it down, child, on thy tablets, and say that I, Henrietta Barclay, charge him for the sake of all he holds dear in heaven or on earth, for his salvation's sake, as well as for the sake of the old home at Leicester Bridge, for the sake of the father and the mother that gave us birth, as well as for the sake of the 6 little children who lie dead between him and me, that he take thee into his home as if thou wert his own flesh and blood, and indeed thou art. He has a wife and children of his own, and no one need fear having thee, my Lois, my darling, my baby, among his household. O Lois, would that thou wert dying with me. The thought of thee makes death sore. Lois comforted her mother more than herself, poor child, by promises to obey her dying wishes to her lover, and by expressing hope she dared not feel of her uncle's kindness. Promise me, the dying woman's breath came harder and harder, that thou wilt go at once. The money our goods will bring, the letter thy father wrote to Captain Holderness, his old schoolfellow. Thou knowest all I would say, my Lois. God bless thee. Solemnly did Lois promise. Strictly she kept her word. It was all the more easy, for Hugh Lucy met her, and told her in one great burst of love of his passionate attachment, his vehement struggles with his father, his impotence at present, his hopes and resolve for the future. And intermingled with all this came such outrageous threats and expressions of uncontrolled vehemence that Lois felt that in Barford she must not linger to be a cause of desperate quarrel between father and son, while her absence might soften down matters so that either the rich old miller might relent, or, and her heart ached to think of the other possibility, Hugh's love might cool, and the dear playfellow of her childhood learn to forget. If not, if Hugh were to be trusted, in one die the wood, he said, God might permit him to fulfill his resolve of coming to seek her out before many years were over. It was all in God's hands, and that was best, thought Lois Barclay. She was roused out of her trance of recollections by Captain Holderness, who, having done all that was necessary in the way of orders and directions to his mate, now came up to her, and praising her for her quiet patience, told her that he would now take her to the Widow Smith's, a decent kind of house, where he and many other sailors of the better order were in the habit of lodging during their stay on the New England shores. Widow Smith, he said, had a parlour for herself and her daughters, in which Lois might sit, while he went about the business that, as he had told her, would detain him in Boston for a day or two before he could accompany her to her uncle's at Salem. All this had been to a certain degree arranged on shipboard, but Captain Holderness, for want of anything else that he could think of to talk about, recapitulated it as he and Lois walked along. It was his way of showing sympathy with the emotion that made her great eyes full of tears as she started up from the pier at the sound of his voice. In his heart he said, poor wench, poor wench. It's a strange land to her, and they are all strange folks, and I reckon she will be feeling desolate. I'll try and cheer her up. So he talked on about hard facts connected with the life that lay before her, until they reached Widow Smith's. Perhaps Lois was more brightened by this style of conversation and the new ideas it presented her than she would have been by the tenderest woman's sympathy. "They are a queer set, these New Englanders," said Captain Holderness. "They are rare chaps for praying, down on their knees at every turn of their life. Folk are none so busy in a new country, else they would have to pray like me, with a yo-hoy on each side of my prayers and a rope cutting like fire through my hand. Yon pilot was for calling us all to Thanksgiving for a good voyage and lucky escape from the pirates, but I said I always put up my thanks on dry land after I got my ship into harbor. The French colonists, too, were vowing vengeance for the expedition against Canada, and the people here are raging like heathens, at least as like as godly folk can be, for the loss of their charter. All that is the news the pilot told me, for all he wanted us to be Thanksgiving instead of casting the lead, he was as down in the mouth as could be about the state of the country. But here we are at Widow Smith's. Now, cheer up, and show the godly a pretty smiling Yorkshire lass." Anybody would have smiled at Widow Smith's greeting. She was a comely, motherly woman, dressed in the primmest fashion in vogue 20 years before in England, among the class to which she belonged. But somehow her pleasant face gave the lie to her dress. Were it as brown and sober-colored as could be, folk remembered it bright and cheerful because it was a part of Widow Smith herself. She kissed Lois on both cheeks before she rightly understood who the stranger maiden was, only because she was a stranger, and looked sad and forlorn. And then she kissed her again because Captain Holderness commended her to the widow's good offices. And so she led Lois by the hand into her rough, substantial log house, over the door of which hung a great bough of a tree, by way of sign of entertainment for man and horse. Yet not all men were received by Widow Smith. To some she could be as cold and reserved as need be, deaf to all inquiries save one, where else they could find accommodation. To this question she would give a ready answer, and speed the unwelcome guest on his way. Widow Smith was guided in these matters by instinct. One glance at a man's face told her whether or not she chose to have him as an inmate of the same house as her daughters, and her promptness of decision in these matters gave her manner a kind of authority which no one liked to disobey, especially as she had stalwart neighbors within call to back her of her assorted deafness in the first instance, and her voice and gesture in the second were not enough to give the would-be guest his dismissal. Widow Smith chose her customers merely by their physical aspect, not one whit with regard to their apparent worldly circumstances. Those who had been staying at her house once always came again, for she had the knack of making everyone beneath her roof comfortable and at ease. Her daughters, Prudence and Hester, had somewhat of their mother's gifts, but not in such perfection. They reasoned a little upon a stranger's appearance instead of knowing at the first moment whether they liked him or no. They noticed the indications of his clothes, the quality and cut thereof, as telling somewhat of his station in society. They were more reserved. They hesitated more than their mother. They had not her prompt authority, her happy power. Their bread was not so light. Their cream went sometimes to sleep when it should have been turning into butter. Their hams were not always just like the hams of the old country, as their mothers were invariably pronounced to be. Yet they were good, orderly, kindly girls, and rose and greeted Lois with a friendly shake of the hand, as their mother, with her arm round the stranger's waist, led her into the private room which she called her parlour. The aspect of this room was strange in the English girl's eyes. The logs of which the home was built showed here and there through the mud plaster, although before both plaster and logs were hung the skins of many curious animals, skins presented to the widow by many a trader of her acquaintance, just as her sailor guest brought her another description of gift: shells, strings of wampum beads, seabirds' eggs, and presents from the old country. The room was more like a small museum of natural history of these days than a parlor, and it had a strange, peculiar, but not unpleasant smell about it, neutralized to some degree by the smoke from the enormous trunk of pine wood which smoldered on the hearth. The instant their mother told them that Captain Holderness was in the outer room, the girls began putting away their spinning wheel and knitting needles and preparing for a meal of some kind. What meal, Lois, sitting there and unconsciously watching, could hardly tell. First, dough was set to rise for cakes. Then came out of a corner cupboard a present from England, an enormous square bottle of a cordial called Golden Wasser. Next, a mill for grinding chocolate, a rare, unusual treat anywhere at that time. Then a great Cheshire cheese. 3 venison steaks were got ready for broiling, fat cold pork sliced up and treacle poured over it, a great pie, something like a mince pie, but which the daughters spoke of with honour as the pumpkin pie, fresh and salt fish brandered, oysters cooked in various ways. Lois wondered where could be the end of the provisions for hospitably receiving the strangers from the old country. At length everything was placed on the table, the hot food smoking, but all was cool, not to say cold, before Elder Hawkins, an old neighbour of much repute and standing, who had been invited in by Widow Smith to hear the news, had finished his grace, into which was embodied thanksgivings for the past and prayers for the future lives of every individual present, adapted to their several cases, as far as the elder could guess at them from appearances. This grace might not have ended so soon as it did, had it not been for the somewhat impatient drumming of his knife handle on the table, with which Captain Holderness accompanied the latter half of the elder's words. When they first sat down to their meal, all were too hungry for much talking, but as their appetites diminished, their curiosity increased, and there was much to be told and heard on both sides. With all the English intelligence, Lois was, of course, well acquainted, but she listened with natural attention to all that was said about the new country and the new people among whom she had come to live. Her father had been a Jacobite, as the adherents of the Stuarts were beginning at this time to be called. His father again had been a fellow of Archbishop Laud, so Lois had hitherto heard little of the conversation, and seen little of the ways of the Puritans. Elder Hawkins was one of the strictest of the strict, and evidently his presence kept the 2 daughters of the house considerably in awe. But the widow herself was a privileged person. Her known goodness of heart, the effects of which had been experienced by many, gave her the liberty of speech which was tacitly denied to many, under penalty of being esteemed ungodly if they infringed certain conventional limits. And Captain Holderness and his mate spoke out their minds, let who would be present, so that on this first landing in New England, Lois was, as it were, gently led down into the midst of the Puritan peculiarities, and yet they were sufficient to make her feel very lonely and strange. The first subject of conversation was the present state of the colony. Lois soon found out that, although at the beginning she was not a little perplexed by the frequent reference to names of places which she naturally associated with the old country, Widow Smith was speaking. Okay, we're just gonna skip ahead a little bit. Okay. By this time, the whole table was silent, listening to the captain. It was just one of those chance silences that sometimes occur without any apparent reason, and often without any apparent consequence. But all present had reason, before many months had passed over, to remember the words which Lois spoke in answer, although her voice was low, and she only thought, in the interest of the moment, of being heard by her old friend the captain. They are fearful creatures, the witches, and yet I am sorry for the poor old women whilst I dread them. We had one in Barford when I was a little child. No one knew whence she came, but she settled herself down in a mud hut by the common side, and there she lived, she and her cat. At the mention of the cat, Elder Hawkins shook his head long and gloomily. No one knew how she lived if it were not on nettles and scraps of oatmeal, and such like food given her more for fear than for pity. She went double, always talking and muttering to herself. Folk said she snared birds and rabbits in the thicket that came down to her hovel. How it came to pass I cannot say, but many a one fell sick in the village, and much cattle died one spring, when I was near 4 years old. I never heard much about it, for my father said it was ill talking about such things. I only know I got a sick fright one afternoon when the maid had gone out for milk and had taken me with her, and we were passing a meadow where the Avon, circling, makes a deep round pool, and there was a crowd of folk, all still, and a still breathless crowd makes the heart beat worse than a shouting, noisy one. They were all gazing towards the water, and the maid held me up in her arms to see the sight above the shoulders of the people. And I saw old Hannah in the water, her grey hair all streaming down her shoulders, and her face bloody and black with the stones and the mud they had been throwing at her, and her cat tied round her neck. I hid my face, I know, as soon as I saw the fearsome sight, for her eyes met mine as they were glaring with fury. Poor, helpless, baited creature. And she caught the sight of me and cried out, Parson's wench, yonder, in thy nurse's arms, thy dad hath never tried for to save me, and none shall save thee when thou art brought up for a witch. Oh, the words rang in my ears when I was dropping asleep for years after. I used to dream that I was in that pond, all men hating me with their eyes because I was a witch. And at times her black cat used to seem living again and say over those dreadful words. Lois stopped. The two daughters looked at her excitement with a kind of shrinking surprise, for the tears were in her eyes. Elder Hawkins shook her head and muttered texts from Scripture, but cheerful Widow Smith, not liking the gloomy turn of the conversation, tried to give it a lighter cast by saying, And I don't doubt but what the parson's bonny lass has bewitched many a one since with her dimples and her pleasant ways. Captain Holderness, it's you must tell us tales of this young lass's doing in England. Aye, said the captain. There's one under her charms in Warwickshire who will never get the better of it, I'm thinking. Elder Hawkins rose to speak. He stood leaning on his hands, which were placed on the table. Brethren, said he, I must upbraid you if ye speak lightly. Charms and witchcraft are evil things. I trust this maiden hath nothing to do with them, even though in thought. But my mind misgives me at her story. The hellish witch might have power from Satan to infect her mind, she being yet a child, with the deadly sin. Instead of vain talking, I call upon you all to join with me in prayer for the stranger in our land, that her heart may be purged from all iniquity. Let us pray. Come, there's no harm in that, said the captain. But Elder Hawkins, when you are at work, just pray for us all, for I'm afeard there may be some of us need purging from iniquity a good deal more than Lois Barclay, and a prayer for a man never does mischief. Captain Holderness had business in Boston, which detained him there for a couple of days, and during that time Lois remained with the widow Smith, seeing what was to be seen of the new land that contained her future home. The letter of her dying mother was sent off to Salem, meanwhile, by a lad going thither, in order to prepare her Uncle Ralph Hixson for his niece's coming, as soon as Captain Holderness could find leisure to take her, for he considered her given into his own personal charge, until he could consign her to her uncle's care. When the time came for going to Salem, Lois felt very sad at leaving the kindly woman under whose roof she had been staying, and looked back as long as she could see anything of Widow Smith's dwelling. She was packed into a rough kind of country cart, which just held her and Captain Holderness beside the driver. There was a basket of provisions under their feet, and behind them hung a bag of provender for the horse, for it was a good day's journey to Salem, and the road was reputed so dangerous that it was ill tarrying a minute longer than necessary for refreshment. English roads were bad enough in that period and for long after, but in America the way was simply the cleared ground of the forest. The stumps of the felled trees still remained in the direct line, forming obstacles, which it required the most careful driving to avoid. And in the hollows where the ground was swampy, the pulpy nature of it was obviated by logs of wood laid across the boggy part. The deep green forest, tangled into heavy darkness even thus early in the year, came within a few yards of the road all the way. The cries of strange birds, the unwonted color of some of them, all suggested to the imaginative or unaccustomed traveler. But at last they drew near to Salem, which rivaled Boston in size in those days, and boasted the name of one or two streets, although to an English eye they looked rather more like irregularly built houses, clustered around the meeting house, or rather one of the meeting houses, for a second was in the process of building. The whole place was surrounded with two circles of stockades. Between the two were the gardens and grazing ground for those who dreaded their cattle straying into the woods, and the consequent danger of reclaiming them. The lad who drove them flogged his spent horse into a trot as they went through Salem to Ralph Hixson's house. It was evening, the leisure time for the inhabitants, and their children were at play before the houses. Lois was struck by the beauty of one wee toddling child, and turned to look after it. It caught its little foot in a stump of wood, and fell with a cry that brought the mother out in a fright. As she ran out, her eye caught Lois's anxious gaze, although the noise of the heavy wheels drowned the sound of her words of inquiry as to the nature of the hurt the child had received. Nor had Lois time to think long upon the matter, for the instant after, the horse was pulled up at the door of a good, square, substantial wooden house, plastered over into a creamy white, perhaps as handsome as a house as any in Salem. And there she was told by the driver that her uncle Ralph Hixson lived. In the flurry of the moment she did not notice, but Captain Holderness did, that no one came out at the unwonted sound of wheels to receive and welcome her. She was lifted down by the old sailor and led into a large room, almost like the hall of some English manor house as to size. A tall, gaunt young man of 24 sat on a bench by one of the windows, reading a great folio by the fading light of day. He did not rise when they came in, but looked at them with surprise. The gleam of intelligence, no gleam of intelligence coming into his stern, dark face. There was no woman in the house place. Captain Holderness paused a moment, and then said, "Is this house Ralph Hixson's?" "It is," said the young man in a slow, deep voice, but he added no word further. "This is his niece, Lois Barclay," said the captain, taking the girl's arm and pushing her forwards. The young man looked at her steadily and gravely for a minute, then rose, and carefully marking the page in the folio, which hitherto had lain open upon his knee, said, still in the same heavy, indifferent manner, "I will call my mother. She will know." He opened a door, which looked into a warm, bright kitchen, ready with the light of the fire, over which 3 women were apparently engaged in cooking something. This is a fairly long story, so I'm doing a little bit of an abridged version, just because there is some longer bits that I find aren't as important to understanding the story. Okay. So she's being introduced to the rest of the family. Captain Holderness spoke. This is Lois Barclay, Master Ralph Hixson's niece. I know nothing of her, said the mistress of the house in a deep voice, almost as masculine as her son's. Master Hixson received his sister's letter, did he not? I sent it off myself by a lad named Elias Welcome, who left Boston for this place yestermorning. Ralph Hixson has received no such letter. He lies bedridden in the chamber beyond. Any letters for him must come through my hands, wherefore I can affirm with certainty that no such letter has been delivered here. His sister Barclay, she that was Henrietta Hixson, and whose husband took the oaths to Charles Stuart and stuck by his living when all godly men left theirs. Lois, who had thought her heart was dead and cold a minute before at the ungracious reception she had met with, felt words come up into her mouth at the implied insult to her father, and spoke out to her own and the captain's astonishment. They might be godly men who left their churches on that day of which you speak, madam, but they alone were not the godly men, and no one has a right to limit true godliness for mere opinion's sake. Well said, lass, spoke out the captain, looking round upon her with a kind of admiring wonder, and patting her on the back. Lois and her aunt gazed into each other's eyes unflinchingly for a minute or two of silence, but the girl felt her colour coming and going, while the elder woman's never varied, and the eyes of the young maiden were filling fast with tears, while those of Grace Hixson kept on their stare, dry and unwavering. Mother, said the young man, rising up with a quicker motion than anyone had yet used in this house, it is ill speaking of such matters when my cousin comes first among us. The Lord may give her grace hereafter, but she has travelled from Boston City today, and she and this seafaring man must need rest and food. So basically, they have a little bit of a conflict, and Lois bursts into tears. Lois had to tell him, Ralph Hixson, that there was no one living to miss her at home in England, that in fact she had no home in England, no father nor mother left upon earth, and that she had bidden by her mother's last words to seek him out and ask him for a home. Her words came up half choked from a heavy heart, and his dulled wits could not take their meaning in without several repetitions, and then he cried like a child, rather at his own loss of a sister, whom he had not seen for more than 20 years, than at that of the orphan standing before him, trying hard not to cry, but to start bravely in this new strange home. What most of all helped Lois in her self-restraint was her aunt's unsympathetic look. Born and bred in New England, Grace Hixson had a kind of jealous dislike to her husband's English relations, which had increased since of late years his weakened mind yearned after them, and he forgot the good reason he had for his self-exile, and moaned over the decision which had led to it as the great mistake of his life. Come, said she, it strikes me that, in all this sorrow for the loss of one who died full of years, ye are forgetting in whose hands life and death are. Lois felt ashamed and sorry to find that her aunt had so truly interpreted the momentary expression of her features. She blamed herself a little for the feeling that had caused that expression, trying to think how much her aunt might have been troubled with something before the unexpected eruption of the strangers, and again hoping that the remembrance of this little misunderstanding would soon pass away. So she endeavoured to reassure herself and not to give way to her uncle's tender, trembling pressure of her hand, as, at her aunt's bidding, she wished him good night and returned into the outer or keeping room, where all the family were now assembled, ready for the meal of flour cakes and venison steaks, which were being brought into the kitchen. Okay. all was ready, Manasseh lifted his right hand and asked a blessing, as it was termed, but the grace became a long prayer for abstract spiritual blessings, for strength to combat Satan and to quench his fiery darts, and at length assumed, so Lois thought, a purely personal character, as if the young man had forgotten the occasion, and even the people present, but was searching into the nature of the diseases that beset his own sick soul, and spreading them out before the Lord. He was brought back by a pluck at the coat from Prudence. He opened his shut eyes, cast an angry glance at the child, who made a face at him for sole reply, and then he sat down, and they all fell to. Grace Hixson would have thought her hospitality sadly at fault if she had allowed Captain Holderness to go out in search of a bed. Skins were spread for him on the floor of the keeping room. A Bible and a square bottle of spirits were placed on the table to supply his wants during the night. And in spite of all the cares and troubles, temptations, or sins of the members of that household, they were all asleep before the town clock struck 10. Okay. And so Lois basically has Elias deliver the letter so that she has the right to claim a home from her nearest relations, as Ralph Hixson. And then it ends here, and Lois was left alone in New England. Then we made it to chapter 2. Okay. It was hard uphill work for Lois to win herself a place in this family. Her aunt was a woman of narrow, strong affections. Her love for her husband, if ever she had any, was burnt out and dead long ago. What she did for him, she did from duty, but duty was not strong enough to restrain that little member, the tongue, and Lois's heart often bled at the continual flow of contemptuous reproof which Grace constantly addressed to her husband, even while she was sparing no pains or trouble to minister to his bodily ease and comfort. It was more as a relief to herself that she spoke in this way than with any desire that her speeches should affect him, and he was too deadened by illness to feel hurt by them, or it may be the constant repetition of her sarcasms had made him indifferent at any rate, so that he had his food and his state of bodily warmth attended to. He very seldom seemed to care for much anything else. Even his first flow of affection towards Lois was soon exhausted. He cared for her because she arranged his pillows well and skillfully, and because she could prepare new and dainty kinds of food for his sick appetite, but no longer for her as his dead sister's child. Still, he did care for her, and Lois was too glad of this little hoard of affection to examine how or why it was given. To him she could give pleasure, but apparently to no one else in that household. Her aunt looked askance for her for many reasons. The first coming of Lois to Salem was inopportune. The expression of disapprobation on her face on that evening still lingered and rankled in Grace's memory. Early prejudices and feelings and prepossessions of the English girl were all on the side of what would now be called church and state. What was then esteemed in that country a superstitious observance of the directions of a popish rubric, and a servile regard for the family of an oppressing and irreligious king. Nor is it to be supposed that Lois did not feel and feel acutely the want of sympathy that all those with whom she was now living manifested toward the old hereditary loyalty, religious as well as political royalty, in which she had been brought up. With her aunt and Manasseh, it was more than want of sympathy. It was positive, active antipathy to all the ideas Lois held most dear. The very allusion, however incidentally made, to the little old grey church at Barford, where her father had preached so long, the occasional reference to the troubles in which her own country had been distracted when she left, and the adherence in which she had been brought up to the notion that the king could do no wrong, seemed to irritate Manasseh past endurance. He would get up from his reading, his constant employment when at home, and walk angrily about the room after Lois had said anything of this kind, muttering to himself. And once he had even stopped before her, and in a passionate tone bade her not talk so like a fool. Now this was very different to his mother's sarcastic, contemptuous way of treating all poor Lois's little loyal speeches. Somehow, Lois felt instinctively that Menesa was really friendly towards her. He was little in the house, there was farming, and some kind of mercantile business to be transacted by him as real head of the house. And as the season drew on, he went on shooting and hunting in the surrounding forests, with a daring which caused his mother to warn and reprove him in private, although to the neighbors she boasted largely of her son's courage and disregard of danger. Lois did not often walk out for the mere sake of walking. There was generally some household errand to be transacted when any of the women of the family went abroad. But once or twice she had caught glimpses of the dreary dark wood, hemming in the cleared land of all sides, the great wood with its perpetual movement of branch and bough, and its solemn wall that came into the very streets of solemn wail that came into the very streets of Salem when certain winds blew, bearing the sound of the pine trees clear upon the ears that had leisure to listen. A little bit about the life in the household and the family dynamics, some of the religious struggles in this village. Okay, so I've skipped ahead to an excerpt of chapter 3 just because there's a lot of interesting plot here with witchcraft that I thought you might enjoy. Okay. Chapter 3, The Sin of Witchcraft. We read about it, we look on it from the outside, but we can hardly realize the terror it induced. Every impulsive or unaccustomed action, every little nervous affection, every ache or pain was noticed, not merely by those around the sufferer, but by the person himself, whoever he might be that was acting or being acted upon in any but the most simple and ordinary manner. He or she, for it was most frequently a woman or girl that was the supposed subject, felt a desire for some unusual kind of food, some unusual motion or rest. Her hand twitched, her foot was asleep, or her leg had the cramp, and the dreadful question immediately suggested itself. Is the cramp? Is anyone possessing an evil power over me by the help of Satan? And perhaps they went on to think, it is bad enough to feel that my body can be made to suffer through the power of some unknown evil wisher to me. But what if Satan gives them still further power, and they can touch my soul and inspire me with such loathful thoughts, leading me into crimes which at present I abhor? And so on, till the very dread of what might happen, and the constant dwelling of the thoughts, even with horror upon certain possibilities, or what were esteemed such, really brought about the corruption of imagination at least, which at first they had shuddered at. Moreover, there was a sort of uncertainty as to who might be infected, not unlike the overpowering dread of the plague, which made some shrink from their best beloved with irrepressible fear. The brother or sister, who was the dearest friend of their childhood and youth, might now be bound in some mysterious deadly pact with evil spirits of the most horrible kind. Who could tell? And in such a case it became a duty, a sacred duty, to give up the earthly body which had been once so loved, but which was now the habitation of a soul corrupt and horrible in its evil inclinations. Possibly, terror of death might bring on confession and repentance and purification. Or, if it did not, why away with the evil creature, the witch, out of the world, down to the kingdom of the Master, whose bidding was done on earth in all manner of corruption and torture of God's creatures. There were others who, to those more simple, if more ignorant. Feelings of horror at witches and witchcraft added the desire, conscious or unconscious, of revenge on those whose conduct had been in any way displeasing to them. Where evidence takes a supernatural character, there is no disproving it. This argument comes up. You have only the natural powers. I have supernatural. You admit the existence of the supernatural by the condemnation of this very crime of witchcraft. You hardly know the limits of the natural powers. How then can you define the supernatural? I say that in the dead of night, when my body seemed to all present to be lying in quiet sleep, I was in the most complete and wakeful consciousness present in my body, at an assembly of witches and wizards with Satan at their head, that I was by them tortured in my body, because my soul would not acknowledge him as its king, and that I witnessed such and such deeds. What the nature of the appearance was that took the semblance of myself, sleeping quietly in my bed, I know not. But admitting, as you do, the possibility of witchcraft, you cannot disprove my evidence. This evidence might be given truly or falsely, as the person witnessing believed it or not. But everyone must see what immense and terrible power was abroad for revenge. Then again, the accused themselves ministered to the horrible panic abroad. Some, in dread of death, confessed from cowardice to the imaginary crimes of which they were accused, and of which they were promised a pardon on confession. Some, weak and terrified, came honestly to believe in their own guilt, though the diseases of imagination which were sure to be engendered at such a time as this. Lois sat spinning with Faith. Both were silent, pondering over the stories that were abroad. Lois spoke first. "Oh, Faith, this country is worse than England was, even in the days of Master Matthew Hopkinson, the witch-finder. I grow frightened of everyone, I think. I even get afeard sometimes of Natty." And they have a conversation about being fearful that everyone around them is a witch, which is really incredible. The rumor of witchcraft was like the echo of thunder among the hills. It had broken out in Mr. Tapo's house, and his two little daughters were the first supposed to be bewitched. But round about, from every quarter of the town, came in accounts of sufferers by witchcraft. There was hardly a family without one of these supposed victims. Then arose a growl and menaces of vengeance from many a household, menaces deepened and daunted by the terror and mystery of the suffering that gave rise to them. At length a day was appointed when, after solemn fasting and prayer, Mr. Tapau invited the neighboring ministers and all godly people to assemble at his house and unite with him in devoting a day to solemn religious services and to supplication for the deliverance of his children and those similarly afflicted from the power of the evil one. All Salem poured out towards the house of the minister. There was a look of excitement on all their faces. Eagerness and horror were depicted on many, while stern resolution, amounting to determined cruelty if the occasion arose, was seen on others. In the midst of the prayer, Hester Tapau, the younger girl, fell into convulsions. Fit after fit came on, and her screams mingled with the shrieks and cries of the assembled congregation. In the first pause, when the child was partially recovered, the people stood around exhausted and breathless. Her father, the pastor Tapau, lifted his right hand and adjured her, in the name of the Trinity, to say who tormented her. There was a dead silence. Not a creature stirred of all those hundreds. Okay, this is where I'm going to stop. If you enjoyed listening to me read this short story, please leave a comment below. Let me know if you would like to hear the rest of it. There's quite a few pages. It's got multiple chapters, actually. Thank you so much for joining me today for this little reading. And I hope that you sleep